think so, no. You want to go next? What, who's yours? Are you all ready? Yeah. So you could step into the gap here.
Good afternoon, fellow coursemates. For those of you who don't already know, I'm Dan, and I'm going to be introducing you all to our presentation on the life, contributions, and ideas of our great economist, Friedrich Hayek. Okay, so there's our introduction. We're going to basically lay out the agenda for this afternoon. Wendy's going to cover the influences and context and influences that surround Hayek, and then Hayek's ideas in literature, the main part of our presentation, is going to be covered by George. Then after that, Kyle's going to hit on the political significance and post-crash applications, and I'll round off with the conclusion. So to basically kind of sum up Hayek in an introductory way, we would look at him as an economist, but also as a philosopher. If you look at Hayek online, you'll basically find kind of these two parts on it. Like some economists, he's also widely known as a philosopher too, with some of his ideas having great political consequences for things. So as an economist, a great contributor to theory on money and economic fluctuations, and that's how he was best known to like the wider world of professionals as economists. But he's also known as a philosopher. F.A. Hayek offers economic theory which translates to working government policy with classical liberalism at heart. So there was his key philosophical point, classical liberalism. So I'm now going to pass you over to Wendy, who's going to cover the context. I'm not going to desk with one.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the context. Hayek was born in 1899 in Vienna to a family of scientists. His father was a botanist, which had a great influence on his work. Hayek was of the Austrian school of thought, and he was a free market economist. This meant that he strongly believed that the market's best left to its own devices and should not be interfered with. This was an unpopular approach after World War II, because in a period of downturn or recession, it is unpopular for politicians to do nothing and sit back. We know during the World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918. This left Austria and many other countries in a dismal condition with hyperinflation and a destroyed empire. In 1974, Hayek won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on the theory of money and economic fluctuations. So, following World War I, Austria experienced hyperinflation of roughly 10,000%. This meant that people often started burning money because this is the cheapest source of fuel than buying coal. In 1930, the Federal Reserve was set up to stabilize US banks, offering a source of credit. However, Hayek believed that the low interest rates were sending the wrong signals to the market. The cheap borrowing led to an unsustainable property boom, and in the 1920s, everyone thought that the boom could never end. Hayek thought differently. So if we look at the influences, he was greatly influenced by his family, which I previously mentioned. With a father as a botanist, Hayek was heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, where he believed in the survival of the fittest. In the economics context, this meant leaving the market to its own devices and leaving the market to fix itself through the exit of unfit firms. He was also heavily influenced by Ludwig von Mises. After university, Mises hired Hayek as a research assistant. Mises helped Hayek to found the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research in the late 1920s. Now I'll pass you on to George, who will talk you through the ideas and the future.
Hi everyone, I'm George. I'm going to speak today about some of Hayek's ideas in literature. Hayek was a great pioneer and had many books and articles published. And today we'll just run through a few of the main ones that best express his ideological beliefs. There you go, these are a few of the ones we'll run through. So we'll start off with the Austrian theory of business, of the business cycle. So for those of you who don't know what the business cycle is, it's basically just the idea that the output of a market economy increases and decreases over time. Hayek offered the theory on this. So he outlined his theory in the book The Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle, which he published in 1929. This date's significant because it was just around the time of the Wall Street crash. This was his principal text. It got him noticed amongst the economic world. The book was inspired by, who Wendy mentioned earlier, Mises, and his book The Theory of Money and Credit that was published in 1912. The book led to him being invited to the economic faculty at LSE, which is important because this is where he would come to debate with his main rival Keynes. So what is the Austrian theory of business? Well, as Dan mentioned earlier, the Austrians believed in a free market, so they were against central regulation. Hayek argued that the previous instability of economies had been caused by the regulation of money by centralised government bodies, such as the Federal Reserve. The reason that Hayek argued that there should be a free market is he argued that central banks could never have enough knowledge to work out the implications of the policies they were implementing. It's significant because this was just after the Wall Street crash. So the abuse and decline of reason. This was Hayek's lifetime work. It started during the war, and it gained British citizenship in 1938. There was a series of books and articles, including the Road to Serfdom, his most famous text. It aimed at analysing the consequences of socialism on the economy over the previous 100 years in the West. Unfortunately, it was incomplete. Hayek died before he was able to complete it. But all of the work that he did complete was eventually published as the studies of the abuse and decline of reason. The Road to Serfdom, this was probably Hayek's most famous book. It was the second edition of the Abuse and Decline of Reason series. It was published in 1944 during the war, and Hayek went as far as he ever went in attacking the attack on Western economies. He argued that a centralised planning was inherently undemocratic. Hayek argued that democracy was the execution of the will of the people by a centralised body. But Hayek argued that centralised planning was the execution of the will of a centralised body on the population, and to this extent it was undemocratic. He also argued that it imposed a lack of freedom on the people with regulation on distribution and consumption of goods. He basically argued that a free market was a better method of regulation. He did, however, accept some regulations. He highly advocated a mandatory state-funded healthcare system, such as the NHS, and also advocated minimum levels of social insurance so that people had shelter, food, and clothing. Later in his career, he started to become more of a philosopher. So one of the biggest things he philosophized about was his economics of science argument. He's argued that people's understanding of science was wrong, and that they thought that science needed demonstrative justification. He said that science was not just a two-way linear relationship, and compared controlling an economy to Darwin's theory of evolution with multivariable relationships. I'll now hand you over to Kaya, who will talk about political significance and post-crash.
Thanks for that, George. So I'm going to talk about political significance, which is just the main impact Hayek had on the life. So during the 1929 Great Depression, a key rivalry that emerged was Hayek versus Keynes. Many people wanted a leader to bring them out of this depression, and the most famous clash was during the 1931 debate at London School of Economics. So sadly, Hayek was sort of outshone by Keynes, because Keynes was easily backed up all his models with maths. Hayek was a bit shaky, wasn't fully understanding what he was talking about himself. So this led to many countries, such as America, following Keynesian economics with high spending, which was clear with the New Deal implemented by Roosevelt during 1933. which was just high growth spending. And sadly, Hayek was sort of ignored in early parts of his life as Keynes just took place. And it's argued the reason this took place is because Keynes often, his policies gave hope. He gave hope that governments could change the situation they were in, but I tend to argue that it's a recession, you can't really do much. You just have to let inefficient businesses shut down. However, this changed thanks to Margaret Thatcher, and she really put Hayek in the spotlight. So Margaret Thatcher was a fan of him. She often kept quotes in her purse to look at for inspiration, and she began to privatise firms and follow deregulation and leave things to the free market. However, this led to a recession in the 1980s, and again Hayek was pushed to the side. However, in my opinion, that was unfair because Margaret Thatcher always offered a safety net to banks, so banks would still lend out money quite riskily. But he did win a Nobel Peace Prize, so he must have been on something. And I'll talk about post-crash applications. So how could we apply this theory now in the situation we have? So I created the 4 S's and the 1B, which is a bit of a controversial point, which I'm going to get onto later. So the 4 S's, so stop decreasing the interest rates. This leads to an expansion in credit, and this expansion in credit only seeps to certain parts of the economies, creating a bubble of growth, which happened in the housing market, leading to a crash and led to where we are today. So we also need to stop bailouts. Bailouts mean inefficient companies can keep on surviving. So again, you get bubbles of growth, you don't get real growth, and you end up solving bad credit with more badly funded credit. So you need to stop bailouts. You also need to stop regulation rules. It is argued that, Hayek argued that economics is not something we can learn in 3 years. It's bigger than us and it's more complex than us. So obviously, if we could predict the economy, we'd all be going to Mario's lectures. Mario would be flying in his private jet. But that doesn't happen. We can't predict the economy with mathematical models. So there's no point. So we've got to stop regulating and stop trying to tamper with stuff we don't know about ourselves. And that leads on to the 4th one, stop trying to predict the economy. And finally, you need to break the monopoly over money, which is it's mainly to do with getting rid of inefficient governments. Because if a government makes a bad decision, you change your money to a different currency, and you get rid of inefficient governments. So generally, the main rule, which I highlighted in purple, is just stop intervention, because the economy is too complex and we don't know enough about it. And I will now pass on to Dan to wrap up.
Thank you for that. Okay, so as we kind of get towards the end of our presentation, we have to ask ourselves, so who was Hayek? I'm aware of the fact that there's loads of presentations being kind of passed by all the time, loads of ideas, technicalities, concepts to kind of understand. So we've brought together some ideas that, as opposed to describe an economist, we create a man for you to kind of have 3 main points to kind of know by. So here's our kind of 3 main points. So Hayek might be the man to captain the ship that sinks and allow a purge of the weak to commence, as this represents his view that the economy should not be saved prematurely, which is what Keynes would have gone for. You might also be the man to start a feud with the father of modern macro, John Maynard Keynes, as they opposed one another on the role of government during the economic cycle. And lastly, on the contrary, you might be best mates with the great Charles Darwin, as they shared a belief in the survival of the fittest. So we need some sort of like summary, which should have came on point by point, but hasn't for me. So the first point, which we look at, economic. Economic regulations are seen to very quickly choke the freedoms offered by the true free market. If regulations allow inefficiency, the problems of now can remain and perhaps cause the problems of the future, such as a future recession. This can be seen with banks, who right now, perhaps, operate knowing, regardless of their performance, they will be bailed out by the government. So the second point that we come to now, political. Instead of government spending creating an environment of market toleration, as with the banks being tolerated, free markets should be left to determine the economic recovery. As we can see, this ties quite closely to Hayek's main economic belief, the first one. And lastly, his ideological belief, perhaps what made his approach quite controversial. The survival of the fittest purges all, and inefficiencies should be eliminated through the liquidation of capital stocks, basically leaving it to sort itself out. And there we have our presentation. We'll take any questions if there are any.
The Higgs group here. The Higgs group is the other guy here, yeah.